The year was 1891. The Wyoming Territory was not just cold, it was being erased. Silver Butte Valley, usually a stark cradle of high desert rock and sagebrush, had vanished under a howling white shroud. The blizzard did not fall. It attacked. It moved sideways. A horizontal scream driven by a wind that scoured the land, burying fence lines, silencing the frozen creeks, and turning the world into a flat, depthless, and blinding white. There was no sky. There was no ground. There was only the storm. A figure moved through this erasure. It was less a person and more a smudge of desperate motion, a dark flaw in the perfection of the white. The figure staggered, fell to one knee, vanishing for a beat before rising again, pushing against the solid wall of the wind. The figure was losing. Gideon Vale felt the pressure of the storm even inside the thick walls of the horse barn. He was 37 years old, though the last 3 years had aged him in dog years, counting 7 for one. He was the owner of the Dry Creek Ranch, a spread of high country grazing land that felt too large and too quiet now. He moved down the line of stalls, his breath pluming in the lamp-lit cold, the solid living smells of horsehide, hay, and frozen leather were his only real company. His hands, thick with calluses from fencing wire, axe handles, and the bitter work of staying alive, ran over the wooden latches. They were hands that knew work, not comfort. They were hands that had buried a wife. He paused by the stall of the big red roan, laying a broad palm on the horse's warm neck. The animal shifted, blowing softly, but Gideon said nothing. Silence had become his habit, his armor. Ever since he and 2 neighbors had lowered Elspeth into the frozen ground 3 winters prior, the silence was a callus on his soul, matching the ones on his hands. He was checking the feed bins, measuring the cost of the blizzard in oats and barley, calculating how many days his stock could last before the cold broke. That was when the sound came. It was not a knock. It was a frantic, weak drumming against the heavy barn door. It was a sound of absolute desperation, almost stolen by the wind's scream. Gideon froze, his head lifted, his gaze locking on the door. No one traveled in this, not ranchers, not trackers, not even the desperate. To be caught out in this was a death sentence. He grabbed the lantern from its hook, the yellow light swinging wild shadows across the packed dirt floor. He moved to the door and slid the heavy iron bolt wood scraping against frozen wood. He pulled the door open just enough to fight the wind, a crack of blinding white. She fell inward, tumbling from the void into the relative dark of the barn. She landed in a heap of snow, soaked rags, and ice on the threshold. Gideon stared, lantern held high. It was a woman. He lowered the light. Her hair, dark, was matted with ice, plastered to a face gone blue-white with cold. She was clutching a worn leather tube against her chest, a grip so tight her knuckles were bloodless. She was dressed in what looked, impossibly, like a wedding dress. Or it had been, once. Now it was torn, the lace stiff with ice, the silk soaked and ruined, little more than layers of tattered rags frozen to her frame. She tried to push herself up onto her elbows, a raw, rattling gasp tearing from her chest. As her hand braced against the floor, the lamplight caught the inside of her wrist, a dark stain, blurred by snow but unmistakable. Ink, a fresh, official-looking smear, the kind left behind by a contract stamp, the mark of servitude. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, black pools of panic in the frozen mask of her face. Then they rolled back, and she collapsed completely. Gideon did not hesitate. He set the lantern on a hay bale, slid the bolt shut against the storm, and scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of wet cloth and cold bones. He carried her out of the barn, bending low against the wind, covering the 50 feet of roaring void to the main ranch house. He kicked the kitchen door open and carried her straight to the hearth. The main fireplace was banked low, embers glowing red in the dim room. He laid her on the thick bear pelt rug, not too close, and began piling fresh kindling and split pine onto the embers. He worked with a grim, practiced economy of motion. Fire first, then coffee. He moved to the stove, dumped grounds from a tin into the battered enamel pot, and added water from the ice bucket, slamming it onto the hot iron surface. Only then did he return to her. "Ma'am?" His voice was rough, a rasp from disuse. No response. She was breathing, shallow and fast, a fish pulled from water. He needed to get the frozen rags off her. He started with the gloves, which were frozen solid to her hands. He had to work them gently, like peeling bark from a live tree, hearing the delicate sound of ice cracking. As he pulled the stiff, wet sleeve of the dress away from her arm, he saw them. Dark, ugly marks circling her upper arm. The distinct, violent shape of fingers. Bruises. Purple at the centers and yellowed at the edges. Gideon stopped. His own hands, the calloused, practical hands, froze for a second. He looked at her face. Her eyes fluttered open. They were not unfocused now. They were sharp, and they were filled with a raw, primal terror. The look of a cornered coyote. The look of an animal that expects the blow. She flinched, trying to pull away from his touch, though she lacked the strength to move. "Easy," Gideon said. The word was a rumble. "You're freezing. The clothes have to come off." He spoke slowly, the same tone he used to calm a spooked horse. He reached for the tiny, frozen pearl buttons on the back of the ruined dress, his thick fingers clumsy and slow. He was immensely careful, moving as if he were handling cracked glass, his touch belying the roughness of his hands. Outside, the wind hit the cabin like a solid fist, rattling the shutters. The glass panes groaned under the pressure. The world was ending out there. But inside, the new wood caught. Flames licked up, casting a warm, flickering light over the scene. The coffee pot began to hiss. And from the back of the stove, another sound joined the room, the gentle, bubbling rhythm of the venison stew he had put on hours ago. It was a quiet, steady sound, the sound of a pulse, the sound of life in a dead world. He managed to get the sodden dress off her shoulders, revealing a thin chemise beneath, also soaked. He did not bother with the rest. He stood, grabbed 2 heavy wool blankets from his own bed chest, and wrapped her tightly, swaddling her like a child. She lapsed back into unconsciousness, muttering a name. "Ephraim, no, please," then just wordless, frightened sounds, as she shivered violently. The leather tube she had guarded so fiercely slipped from her grasp and rolled onto the hearthstones with a soft thud. Gideon picked it up. It was cheap calfskin, the wax seal broken. A document was partially unfurled inside. He pulled it out, the paper stiff with cold. It was an indenture, a contract. He saw the seal at the bottom first, Calder Mining and Milling. Ephraim Calder, the name she had whispered. His eyes scanned the dense legal text, the ink sharp and black against the paper. His gaze snagged on one particular line, nestled deep in the 4th paragraph. In return for the cancellation of said debt, the signatory does pledge the full service of person and body for the duration of the term. Gideon read it twice. Service of person and body. It was an old phrase, a cruel one, a phrase that turned a human being into livestock. It was ink wrapped around a throat. It was a cage made of paper. He saw the signature at the bottom, shaky but clear Mara Ellison. He looked from the paper to the woman shivering by his fire. He saw the ink stain on her wrist, the bruises on her arm, the absolute terror in her eyes when she had briefly woken. He folded the contract slowly, deliberately, the crease sharp and final. He pushed it back into the leather tube. The coffee began to boil over, the sharp, bitter smell cutting through the cold. Mara Ellison stirred, her breathing still ragged. Gideon stood, blocking the firelight, a tall, solid shadow. He slid the tube onto the high mantelpiece, well out of her immediate reach, but safe. He looked down at her face, pale and exhausted in the firelight. "You're safe here," Gideon Vale whispered. The words spoken mostly to himself. The words felt strange in the room Elspeth had built, but they settled the air. Nobody owns a person. Mara woke to a world that was silent. The screaming wind had died, leaving a profound, muffled stillness that felt heavier than the storm itself. The first thing that registered was the smell. It was not the odor of ice or fear. It was savory. It was beans and smoked ham. She opened her eyes. They felt gritty, glued shut. She was on the floor, wrapped in heavy wool blankets, near a fireplace that was now a bed of warm, gray ash. Across the main room, pale, watery sunlight, the kind that only follows a blizzard, cut a sharp rectangle onto a simple pine table. The light was weak, but after the blinding whiteout, it seemed impossibly bright, illuminating every knife mark and grain in the wood. Gideon Vale was there, sitting at the table. He was not looking at her. He was looking into a tin mug of coffee, his broad back mostly turned. He was a mountain of stillness. She moved. The wool blankets rasped. His head turned, not quickly, but with a deliberate weight. His eyes were gray, the color of the sky just before the snow hits. "You're awake," he stated. It was not a question. Her voice was a dry scratch. "Where am I?" "Dry Creek Ranch. You collapsed at my barn." He gestured with his chin toward the stove. "There's soup and coffee." She pushed herself up on one elbow, the room tilting slightly. Her body ached with a deep, bone-cold exhaustion. She saw the leather tube sitting on the high mantelpiece. "The paper?" she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her chest. Gideon nodded. He stood, his shadow covering her. He retrieved the tube and brought it to the table. He did not hand it to her. He laid it between them, a dead thing on the bright wood. "Calder Mining and Milling," Gideon said. His voice was flat. "Ephraim Calder." Mara flinched, a sharp, visible intake of breath. The name was a physical blow. She pulled the blankets tighter, sitting up fully. "He knows you're gone," Gideon asked. "He knows I ran." She clutched the blanket. I thought the storm would cover my tracks." "Or kill you," Gideon finished, his tone devoid of judgment. It nearly did. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "You owe him money." "My uncle did," she said, the words rushing out now, brittle and cold. "Arthur, he had a prospecting loan from Mr. Calder, for a claim up north, by the Wind Rivers. When he passed last month, the debt, it fell to me. I was his only kin. So you came to Pine Hollow to settle it. I came to ask for time," she corrected, a spark of heat in her raw voice. "I offered to work at the mine office, to keep the books. I'm good with figures. I can read and write proper." Gideon waited, his stillness an invitation for the truth. Mr. Calder, he refused." She looked down. "He said the debt was substantial, over $900. He said there was only one way to clear such a sum quickly. He called it an indenture of service." She looked at the leather tube with revulsion. "He had the papers ready. His lawyer was there. Pierce Dalton, from Pine Hollow. He had his official seal, all ready." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "Dalton, a man known for bending the law until it snapped, then selling the broken pieces. They told me it was a standard servant in debt contract to work in his house, as a maid. 6 months, he said, and the debt would be cleared." 6 months for $900, Gideon said, the skepticism heavy in his low voice. "That's high pay for a housemaid." Mara's gaze dropped to her hands, which were twisting the wool. "I didn't read all of it. I was scared. They were just watching me. The lawyer," he tapped the page with his pen. "Sign here, Miss Ellison. It is the only way to honor your uncle's debt and avoid debtor's prison." "The line," Gideon said quietly, cutting to the bone. "The one about disposition." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shame and terror. "You read it. Service of person and body," Gideon recited. The words sounded foul in the quiet room. Mara began to tremble, a violent shudder that had nothing to do with the cold. "I didn't understand, not until after the ink was dry. Mr. Calder," he smiled. "He told me my duties would begin that evening. He took my arm." She unconsciously rubbed the spot where the bruises were fading, a dark stain against her pale skin. Gideon looked at the fading bruises, Then, at the contract, he understood instantly. This was not a fake marriage plot. Those were complicated, sometimes even voluntary. This was simpler. It was cruder. It was slavery, wrapped in legal paper and tied with a lawyer's ribbon. It was an attempt to own her, body and soul, legitimized by the town's own legal counsel. So you ran. I took the dress. It was my mother's. I thought I could sell it in Cheyenne for passage back east. I waited until they were at dinner. I stole a horse blanket from his stable, but the horse bolted. I just ran. I ran south, toward the valley. Then the snow started. A heavy silence filled the cabin. The only sound was the soft tick and bubble of the bean soup simmering on the stove. Mara pushed the heavy blankets back. She tried to stand, but her legs were weak. She braced herself on the table, her knuckles white. I must go. He will come looking for me. I cannot bring this trouble to your door. Go where? Gideon asked. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The snow is 8 feet deep in the valley. It's drifted 20 feet high in the passes. Nothing is moving in or out of this valley for a week. Maybe 2. I cannot stay, she insisted, her voice cracking with desperation. You do not understand him. He is not just a man. He owns the town. He owns the mine. He owns the sheriff. He doesn't own this ranch. He will, she pleaded, tears of frustration freezing in her eyes. He'll send his men. They'll hurt you. They'll take your stock. I have to leave. I will not be the reason you lose this. Gideon stood up. He was a tall man, and the low-beamed ceiling seemed to shrink around him. He walked to the window, scraping ice from the pane with his thumbnail. He looked out at the blinding, unbroken white that seemed to stretch to the end of the world. You walk out that door. You'll be dead in an hour, he said, his back to her. The cold will take you before Calder's men even saddle up. Leaving is death, staying is life. It's that simple. You're offering me what shelter protection? He turned. His face was hard, carved from the same rock as the mountains outside. I'm offering you the fire and the food. I'm not offering to fight your fight. But I will not turn a dog out in this. And you're not a dog. He saw the fear still warring with her pride. She was looking at him as if he were just a different kind of trap. He understood that, too. There's a room, he said, jerking his head toward a narrow door off the kitchen. It's small. Used to be a pantry, then a washroom. It's got a cot. It's yours. He crossed to the kitchen counter, picked up a clean bowl from the drying rack, and ladled it full of the thick, steaming soup. He set it on the table. Then he opened a drawer, took out a small, sharp paring knife with a worn wooden handle. He placed it on the table next to the bowl. Mara stared at the knife. It was a weapon. The room is yours, Gideon repeated, his voice low and steady. The door doesn't lock from the outside. You have this. He nodded at the knife. I will not enter. You have my word. That's all I can give you. She looked from the knife to his face. He was giving her the right to self-defense. Against him. It was the first real power she had been given in months. What do you expect from me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The storm has shut us in. I have stock to feed in the barn. Horses, 6 cows, chickens. It's a full-time job breaking ice and hauling hay. This house. He motioned around the room, which was clean but stark. Has been empty. I can't manage both. You want to cook? She whispered. I want the work shared, he corrected, his gaze level. A temporary arrangement. You handle the kitchen, the hearth, the mending. I handle the barn and the woodpile. We respect the boundary. When the thaw comes, you are free to go. She slowly reached out and touched the wooden handle of the knife. It was a clear, sharp, cold steel agreement. No illusions. No false kindness. Yes, I can do that. I can work. Good. Eat. Then find the clothes I left by the fire. They belong to my wife. They'll be too big for you, but they're warm. He said the word wife without flinching. But as he turned to pull on his heavy sheepskin coat, his gaze caught on a single, plain object. Hanging from a square-cut nail driven into the log wall near the door was a simple, worn, gold wedding band. Gideon looked at the ring, his hand frozen on his coat. 3 years, 3 years of silence, 3 years of dust gathering on Elspeth's loom, 3 years of cooking for one and one alone. A wave of memory, so sharp it was almost a physical pain, rose in his chest, the smell of her baking bread, the sound of her laugh by the creek, the warmth of her hand in his. It was a familiar ache, a cold, hollow spot in his gut. But today, mingled with it, was something else. Not warmth, but a disruption, a complication. He looked at the ring, then at the woman sitting at his table, holding a paring knife. He pulled his hat low, grabbed his heavy gloves, and went out into the blinding snow. The door closing with a heavy, final thud. Mara ate. The soup was hot, and it burned a path of life back into her frozen core. She found the clothes, a heavy wool skirt and a simple flannel shirt. As Gideon had said, they were large, but they were clean and blessedly warm. She dressed, feeling the heavy, honest fabric against her skin. She was alone in the cabin. It was sturdy, clean, but stark. It was the home of a man who was not living, only surviving. The kitchen stove was the heart of the room, but its fire was burning low, threatening to go out. She looked at it. She knew stoves. She went to the wood box, her hands trembling slightly, not from cold now, but from weakness and adrenaline. She loaded the firebox with fresh kindling and a few pieces of split pine. She struck a match. The first one sputtered and died in her shaky fingers. The second, she shielded with her cupped hands. The flame caught the dry kindling. It hesitated, then flared, a bright orange bloom in the dark iron. She stood back as the fire caught, the stovepipe beginning to tick and ping with the growing heat. The kitchen, which had been silent and cold, began to feel like a room again. She had brought fire back to it. She had revived the heart. She found the coffee pot, emptied the old grounds, and measured fresh ones. She found flour, salt, lard. She could make biscuits. She could work. Work was something she understood. As she moved, finding her rhythm, her hands dusting with flour, a sound cut through the vast, white silence outside. It was long, high, and mournful, a steam whistle. It carried for miles on the cold, clear air. Mara froze, her hands covered in flour. It was the midday shift whistle from the Calder mine, miles down the valley. It was a reminder. The storm had stopped. The thaw would come, and Ephraim Calder was still out there, sitting on his mountain of silver, reading his copy of her contract. He was waiting. It took 9 days. 9 days for the sky to clear, for the wind to die to a whisper, and for the white, silent world to begin weeping. The thaw came not as a gentle release, but as a muddy, groaning collapse. The sound of running water, sharp and violent, returned to the valley. Dry Creek, the artery of Gideon's land, began to swell, thick and brown, with the melt. With the passable roads came the need for supplies. The storm in the new mouth to feed had run the pantry low. Gideon hitched the buckboard. Mara stood on the porch, wrapped in one of Elspeth's old wool shawls. The past 9 days had been a truce governed by necessity. He worked the barn, breaking ice in the trough, clearing snow from the corral, mucking stalls. She worked the house. The cabin was warmer than it had been in 3 years. The smell of baking bread, of simmering soup, had returned. They spoke little, but a rhythm was established. It was a truce of shared labor, a respectful distance measured in feet and silence. "I'm going to Pine Hollow," he announced, his voice a low rumble. "Need grain, salt, coffee." She stopped wiping the pine table, her hands, raw from lye soap, stilled. Will they be looking? They will now. He offered no comfort, no lie. He did not offer to hide her, nor did he offer to take her. It was a fact. The world was returning, and the world included Ephraim Calder. Pine Hollow was a long, muddy scar in the valley floor, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled in the shadow of the mountain. The mountain was home to the Calder mine. and the mine owned the town. It owned the saloon, the mercantile, the bank, and, most said, the law. When Gideon Vale pulled his wagon up to Reed's mercantile, the low hum of activity on the boardwalk paused. Men in muddy boots, miners coming off shift, and ranchers in for supplies all stopped. They stared. Gideon Vale, the widower recluse of Dry Creek, had not been seen at a market day in 6 months. His presence alone was an event. He swung down from the buckboard, his heavy coat making him seem even larger. He walked into the store, his spurs quiet on the wooden planks. Jed Lyle, Calder's pit foreman, was standing by the pot-bellied stove, spitting tobacco juice into a cuspidor. He saw Gideon, and a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. Gideon ignored him, walking to the counter where young Reed Holloway stood. "Reed, I need 5 sacks of oats, 2 of salt, 100 pounds of flour, and 5 of Arbuckle's coffee." Lyle's voice, oily and loud, filled the sudden quiet. "Well, look here, it's the ghost of Dry Creek. Heard you had a rough storm up your way. Vale—" Gideon did not turn. He kept his eyes on Holloway. "Heard you took in a stray." Lyle pushed, his voice laced with insinuation. "Word is, Mr. Calder is missing some property." The store was utterly silent. Holloway's hand froze above his ledger. Gideon turned his head, just enough to fix Lyle with his cold, gray gaze. Then he looked back at Holloway. "And add a box of 4570 cartridges." The message was delivered. Lyle's smile faltered, but the damage was done. The rumor, which had been a whisper, was now a public proclamation. "Gideon Vale is sheltering Calder's woman." The word spread from the mercantile to the saloon, from the saloon to the smithy, from the smithy to the church sewing circle. By the time Gideon was loading his wagon, the entire town knew. The law came 2 days later. Mara saw him first, a single rider, moving at a steady, official trot, his hat brim pulled low. "Rider," she said, her voice tight. She was at the stove, but her hand was on the small paring knife Gideon had given her, which she now kept tucked in her apron pocket. Gideon moved to the window and looked out. "It's the law," he said. He recognized the man. Sheriff Lonnie Pike. Pike was a man stretched thin. He wore a star, but everyone in the valley knew Ephraim Calder paid for the polish. He was not a bad man, merely a practical one. And in Pine Hollow, practicality and Calder's will were the same thing. Gideon met him on the porch, blocking the doorway. "Lonnie." "Gideon." Pike nodded, his eyes cold and professional. He did not dismount. His gaze flickered past Gideon's shoulder, into the dim warmth of the cabin. "Searching. Been a long winter." "It has. Word is you found something. During the storm. I found a woman half frozen to death by my barn. I brought her in." Pike's gaze hardened. "A woman named Mara Ellison. Mr. Calder filed a complaint. Obstruction of contract. Harboring of chattel." "Chattel." Gideon's voice was dangerously low. "His words. The paperwork calls her a servant in debt. Signed and sealed by Pierce Dalton. Right here in town. It's legal. I've seen the copy." "She's in the kitchen," Gideon said, unmoving. "She's not chattel." "The law says different. Gideon, I'm here to retrieve her. Mr. Calder wants his property back." Pike finally swung down from his horse, his hand resting near the butt of his revolver. It was not a threat, just a reminder of his office. "Ma'am," Pike called past Gideon, his voice louder. "I know you're in there. I have a writ to return you to the custody of your legal guardian." Mara appeared in the doorway behind Gideon. Her face was pale, but her eyes were hot. The paring knife was visible in her hand. Pike tipped his hat. The gesture was polite, but his eyes were flat. "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult. Just come with me." "No," she whispered. "She's not going," Gideon said. Pike let out a long, frustrated sigh. "Gideon, for God's sake, don't be a fool. This ain't your fight. Calder owns that paper. He owns her. As far as the territory is concerned, you stand in the way. You're breaking the law. I'll have to arrest you. Come inside, Lonnie." It was not an invitation. It was a command. Have some coffee. Before you start quoting law you clearly don't understand. The sheriff hesitated. Gideon Vale was not a man to be pushed. Pike looked at Gideon's stony face, then at the defiant woman, and then back at the long, muddy ride to town. He unhitched his gun belt and hung it on the saddle horn. A gesture of truce. Fine, but this coffee won't change the facts. We'll see. The cabin was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and wood smoke. Mara stood by the hearth, her back rigid, her hand still clutching the knife. Pike took the chair Gideon offered, placing his hat on the pine table. Gideon poured 2 mugs of coffee. He set one in front of the sheriff. He pushed the second mug toward Mara. She did not take it. Her eyes were locked on Pike. Gideon, Pike began. Just listen to reason. Calder is a powerful man. You can't win this. Gideon walked to the high mantelpiece. He took down the leather tube. He laid it on the table between them, the same table where Mara had first woken. He unrolled the document, the thick paper crackling in the quiet. I've seen it, Pike said, annoyed. Dalton showed me the copy. It's ironclad. Is it? Gideon's thick finger, calloused and scarred, landed on the first paragraph. He had not read the contract since that first night. Now, he read it with the focus of a hunter. He read the names, Mara Ellison, Ephraim Calder. He read the sum, $942. He read the terms. His finger stopped. Lonnie, read this part. Pike leaned forward, squinting. Gideon read aloud. This indenture entered into by Ephraim Calder, and by proxy for the estate of Arthur Ellison, deceased. He paused. By proxy? Who's the proxy? Jed Lyle, Pike answered. Calder's foreman. His name is right there. I see that. Gideon's voice was quiet, dangerous. He looked at Mara. Ma'am, when your uncle died, did you go before a judge was an executor named for his estate? Mara looked confused. A judge? No. I just got a letter from Mr. Calder saying I owed the money. I came here. That's all. Gideon looked back at the sheriff. When a man dies in this territory, Lonnie, his debts are handled by the probate court. The court names an executor, a legal representative. Was there a probate hearing for Arthur Ellison? Pike shifted in his chair. I don't know. Gideon, that's court business, not my concern. It's your concern now. Gideon said, was there any document, any letter of administration, any piece of paper from a judge that gave Jed Lyle the legal authority to act as proxy for Arthur Ellison's estate? I don't recall seeing one, Pike admitted, because there isn't one. Gideon said, his voice like grinding stone. This contract was built on sand. The debt was never legally transferred to her in the first place. This paper, he tapped it, is worthless. Pike stared. Gideon, that's a hell of an accusation. That's for a judge in Cheyenne to decide, not you. It is. Gideon agreed. A judge can argue about the money. That's law. But this... His finger moved to the 4th paragraph, the line that had burned in his memory. The signatory does pledge the full service of person and body. This, Gideon said, his voice dropping, is not law. This is a violation of decency. You can't own a person's body in Wyoming, not for debt, not for anything. Before Pike could form a protest, Gideon stood, went to a small desk in the corner, and came back. He held a small, corked inkwell and a steel-nibbed pen. Gideon, no, Pike warned, standing up. Don't you touch that paper. That is a legal document. You tamper with it. I'll arrest you right now for destruction of evidence. It's an immoral document, Gideon corrected, uncorking the ink. And a man who watches an immoral act and does nothing is partner to it. He dipped the pen. Gideon, I am warning you. Gideon pressed the nib to the paper. The scratch of steel on parchment was the only sound, with 2 thick, angry, diagonal lines. He struck out the words and body. He did not stop. He drew a heavy, black, definitive line through the entire phrase, service of person and body. The ink was wet and absolute. Then, in the margin, his own handwriting, clear and strong. filled the space. This clause voided as a violation of public morals. Witnessed, Gideon Vale, Dry Creek, March 14th, 1891. He signed his name. He set the pen down. He blew gently on the ink. There! Pike was speechless, his face pale with fury and a strange, grudging respect. Damn it! Vale, you just signed your own death warrant. You just put your head in the lion's mouth. Calder will ruin you for this. Gideon looked up, his gray eyes flat and cold as a frozen lake. Better than inviting chains into my home. He carefully folded the document. I'll be riding to Silver Butte tomorrow to send a certified copy of this, and my own affidavit, to the district court. You can tell Mr. Calder I'm contesting the legality of this entire document on grounds of fraud. And you can tell him that Mara Ellison stays here, not as a servant, not as property, as a free woman, under my protection. Sheriff Pike stared at the folded paper. He looked at Gideon's unmoving face. He looked at Mara. She was still by the hearth, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. It was the first time in her life, a man had stood between her and the brutal power that sought to crush her. Pike snatched his hat from the table. You're a fool, Gideon. You just invited more trouble than this valley can hold. He stormed out, yanking his horse's reins and mounting in one angry motion. The rest is between you, Calder, and God. Gideon watched him ride until he was a small dot in the mud. Mara finally sat, her legs giving way. She stared at the ink-stained pen on the table. He'll destroy you, she whispered. He'll take this ranch. He can try. Gideon was already pulling his heavy coat back on. He'll start with the water. The town split like firewood under an axe. The miners and saloon men, whose pay came from Calder's pocket, turned cold. They saw Gideon as a fanatic, a fool risking their livelihoods. But others rallied. That Sunday, Reverend Abigail Thorne, a stern, gray-haired woman who feared nothing, stood in the pulpit of the town's tiny Presbyterian church. She did not preach on mercy. She preached from Exodus. I hear talk of contracts, she boomed, her fierce eyes sweeping over the congregation, landing hard on Pierce Dalton, the lawyer, in the third row. I hear talk of debt. Let me speak of a higher contract, the one that states a man is made in God's image. The one that states you shall not make a bondsman of your brother, I say to you. No man belongs to another man. Not in this valley, not under this sky. The war had begun. Calder's response was swift and silent. 3 days later, the flow of Dry Creek, the artery of Gideon's ranch, slowed to a muddy trickle. Gideon rode upstream, just as he'd expected. A fresh ditch, dug deep, diverting nearly all the spring melt-off away from his land and toward the massive new ore-stamping mill the mine was building. It was a quiet, devastating act of war. Without that water, his spring planting would fail. His cattle would thirst by summer. The ranch would die. He rode back to the cabin, his face a mask of controlled fury. The next day, he rode back into Pine Hollow. He didn't go to the sheriff. He went to the mercantile. Reed, he said to Holloway, I need more seed. Twice what I bought last week. Barley and oats, and all the vegetable seed you have. Holloway looked ill. Gideon, I can't. A runner from Mr. Calder's office was just here. He put a hold on your credit. Indefinitely. I'm not asking for credit. Gideon reached deep into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and emptied it onto the counter. A stream of gold coins, bright and heavy. Elspeth's savings, the last of it. I'm paying in cash. He bought the seed. He bought more cartridges. He bought 2 new shovel heads. As he was leaving, he saw a young Cornish miner, Tam, watching him. Tam had a wife and 3 small children. His face was etched with worry. Gideon stopped. He walked to his wagon, pulled out a 20-pound sack of flour, and tossed it to the miner. Tam fumbled, catching it. Mr. Vale, I can't pay. It's not for sale. Gideon pulled a small ledger and a pencil from his coat. He wrote Tam, 1 sack flour, paid when you can. After the harvest. He tore the page out and handed it to the man. It was not a bill. It was a note of credit. It was an act of faith. Gideon Vale rode out of town, his wagon loaded with seed he had no water for, and ammunition he would almost certainly have to use. The act of sheltering a woman had become a quiet declaration of war. He was no longer just protecting a person. He was fighting for the soul of the valley. Winter held on with a bitter, clawing grip. The thaw had come to the lowlands, but up at Dry Creek, the night still brought a hard frost, and the wind still had the memory of ice in it. The diverted creek remained a shallow, muddy tragedy, a brown ribbon in a thirsty field. Their world was reduced to the hard, physical realities of survival, and the work was the only wall they had against the encroaching shadow of Ephraim Calder. They rode the north pasture, where the snow had finally melted from the fence line, revealing the winter's damage. The wire was snapped in 3 places, the posts heaved and broken by the frost. It was cold, back-breaking labor. Gideon, his shoulders straining against his coat, drove the new posts into the unyielding, half-frozen earth. The heavy thud of the post driver was the only sound, a grim heartbeat in the vast, silent valley. Mara, her hands raw inside Elspeth's old work gloves, handled the wire stretcher. She braced her boots in the mud, pulling the viciously barbed wire taut until it hummed with tension. Then holding it steady while he stapled it fast, she did not complain. She did not falter. Her slight frame held a surprising, wiry strength. She watched him, learned the rhythm of his movements, the heave, the strike, the check, and she matched it. He found he did not need to give her instruction twice. The truce of the storm had solidified into a partnership of necessity, of shared labor, but it was a partnership nonetheless. The true test came in the barn. The air inside was thick, steaming with the heat of animals and hay, a sharp contrast to the biting cold outside. A young heifer, one of his best, was in labor. She had been at it for hours, her moans low and pained, her eyes wide with animal panic. Gideon had been checking on her all night. He went in again, his arm bared, and his face was grim when he pulled back. "It's wrong," he said, his voice flat and tired. He wiped his arm on a sack. "It's a breach. One leg is back. I can't turn it." He began uncoiling a length of rope. His movements were resigned, economical. He was preparing to lose the calf to save the mother. "Wait." Mara's voice cut through the heavy air. She was at the cow's head, her hand pressed flat between the animal's horns, her other hand stroking the sweaty, trembling neck. "She's still trying. Let me—" Gideon paused, rope in hand. "My uncle's neighbor, back in Missouri," she said, her voice quick and focused, all traces of fear gone. "He was the county veterinarian. I helped him from the time I was 12 until I left, almost 4 years. I know this. I've seen him do this." Gideon looked at her, the woman who had collapsed in the snow, who flinched at raised voices, was gone. In her place was someone else, someone with a cold, clear competence in her eyes. He stepped back. "What do you need?" "Hot water," she ordered, already pushing the sleeves of her flannel shirt high up her arms. "As hot as we can get, and that rope, but make a gentle noose, and clean straw, lots of it." He moved without question, stoking the small stove in the tack room, filling the bucket. When he returned, she had the cow soothed, her voice a low, steady murmur. "Easy, girl, easy now. You have to work with me. You have to breathe with me." She laid out the clean straw. She looked at Gideon, her eyes locking with his. "This is what we do. When she strains, I'm going to go in. I need you on the rope. You'll loop it on the one hoof that's out. Just keep it steady. Do not pull. When I tell you to, I need you to pull. But pull down, toward her hocks, not straight back. Gently. Understand?" He nodded. "She is going to scream." Mara said, "So am I. Don't stop unless I say—" She turned, took a breath, and plunged her arm deep into the laboring animal. The cow bellowed, a sound of agony, and tried to surge. "Hold her! Gideon!" Mara grunted, her face pale and beaded with sweat, her entire body braced. "Easy, girl, easy. I have it. I have the leg. God, it's slick. Okay, okay." The heifer strained again, a massive, shuddering contraction. "Now, Gideon, hold her. That's it. She's pushing. I'm turning it. I'm turning it." Mara's voice was a tight gasp. Her eyes squeezed shut in concentration. "Okay, I have it. Both feet. Both feet. Put the rope on both. Quick." He worked fast, his large, clumsy hands securing the noose. "On the next push," Mara yelled. "Pull." Pull gently. Pull down. Now pull. It was a grim, primal dance. Gideon leaned back, his boots sliding in the muck, his muscles straining. He pulled, feeling the terrible, vital resistance. Mara was beside him, both hands on the rope now, her face a mask of effort. "Again harder, she's giving up, pull." The cow gave a final, heaving moan. And then, a sudden, wet, steaming rush. A small, perfect, red calf tumbled onto the clean straw, followed by a gush of fluid. It was alive. It coughed, its head shaking weakly. The barn was suddenly, profoundly silent, broken only by the mother's exhausted, ragged breathing. Mara sagged against the stall, her legs giving way. She was breathing as hard as the cow, her arms covered in blood and birth fluid. Gideon dropped the rope, his own hands shaking. "You did it," he said. The words felt inadequate. "We did." She breathed. She crawled forward on her knees and cleared the calf's mouth and nose with her fingers. The calf gave a wet snort and tried to lift its head. The mother, her panic gone, began to lick it. Mara smiled, a raw, exhausted smile. "It's a bull." Gideon knelt beside her. You saved them both." He reached for a clean piece of sacking to help rub the calf dry. As he did, his hand, calloused and stained, brushed against hers. It was an accident, just a simple touch. Skin on skin, warm and wet, in the middle of the mess and the miracle. It was not a caress. It was a collision. Their eyes met, over the head of the new life. It lasted no more than a second, but in that 1 second, a current passed between them. It was not lust. It was something deeper. It was a shared, profound, animal relief. It was the look of two people who had just fought a battle together and won. It was respect. Mara's breath caught. Her face, already flushed from the exertion, turned a deeper shade of red. She looked away first, her gaze dropping to the straw, suddenly conscious of the heat in the barn, the steam of their breath, the intimacy of the moment. Gideon cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. He stood up abruptly. I'll get her fresh water and a bran mash." He turned and left the stall. The boundary, blurred for just an instant, falling back into place. That night, the cabin felt different. The shared victory from the barn followed them inside. After Mara had washed, her hair damp by the hearth, she did not sit idle. She retrieved a small bundle of cloth from her meager belongings. It was a yard or two of pale blue calico. "What's that?" Gideon asked. He was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, the smell of gun oil sharp in the room. "Curtains," she said, threading a needle. "For the kitchen window. The morning light is so strong, it's hard to see the stove." He paused, his hand stopping its methodical work. He watched the needle flash in the firelight. Elspeth had sewn in that same chair. The house had not seen new cloth, new color, in 3 years. This blue was the color of a spring sky. It was an act of hope, an act of permanence. It made the stark, masculine room feel human. The next day, Gideon attacked the chimney. The long winter had left it thick with creosote, and the draw was bad, puffing smoke back into the room. He spent the morning on the roof, working the heavy brushes, and the afternoon cleaning out the hearth. When he was finished, he was covered, head to foot, in a thick layer of greasy, black soot. A stripe ran from his hairline down his nose, and his chest, visible where his shirt was unbuttoned, was black. Mara was at the counter, kneading dough for tomorrow's bread, her own hands and arms white with flour. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes widened. A small sound, a pfft, escaped her lips. She tried to stifle it, pressing her floury hands to her mouth, but it was no use. Her shoulders began to shake. Gideon frowned. "What?" She pointed, a giggle breaking free. Your face. You look like a—" He rubbed his cheek, which only smeared the soot into a perfect black handprint. She let out a full, bright, unrestrained laugh. It was a sound he had never heard from her. It was not a giggle of fear or politeness. It was a genuine, bubbling laugh that shocked the quiet, heavy air of the cabin. He looked at his own black hand. He looked at her face lit with mirth, her eyes dancing. A slow, rusty smile cracked his own soot-stained face. Then a low chuckle rumbled in his chest. It was a sound that had not been heard in that room in a very, very long time. They stood there for a long moment, the man of soot and the woman of flour, and laughed. The crushing, unspoken tension of the last weeks, the fear of Calder, the ghosts of the past, all of it just broke, washed away in a simple, ridiculous moment. The ink stain on Mara's wrist, the physical mark of her indenture, was fading. The harsh black letters had blurred into a pale, bluish ghost of the shackle it had been, and as the stain faded, her confidence grew. Gideon had a horse, a skittish gray gelding named Ashen, that Elspeth had hand-raised but never managed to break. He was headstrong, wary, and distrusted Gideon's heavy hand. Mara started visiting him at the corral fence. She would bring a piece of apple, or just stand there, talking to him in the same low, steady voice she had used on the birthing cow. Gideon watched from the porch. The horse, which shied from his own touch, would, after many days, lower its proud head and let her stroke its neck. "You have a way with broken things," Gideon said one evening, his voice rough. "He's not broken," she replied, not looking up from her mending. "He's just scared. He's waiting for someone to be patient." 2 weeks later, Gideon watched from the barn as she rode Ashen bareback around the corral, her hands light, her body moving with the horse's rhythm. He, in turn, gave her a different kind of power. He took his spare rifle, a Winchester carbine, down from the wall. "You're under my protection," he said, his voice practical. "But my protection might not always be there. You need to know how to protect yourself. For real." He took her to the gully behind the house, far from the stock. He set up 3 empty bean tins on a fallen log 50 yards away. He was a patient, safe teacher. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the stock against her shoulder so it would not bruise her. "Breathe," he instructed, his voice low, standing just behind her. "Let half your breath out, then squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it, squeeze it, like you're squeezing a hand." Her first shot was high, kicking up dust on the ridge. The second was wide, whining off a rock. The sound of the rifle cracked against the high canyon walls. "You're flinching," he said, his voice calm. "You're anticipating the noise. Don't think about the bang. Just think about the front sight. Put it right on top of the tin." She reloaded, her jaw set. She breathed in, let half her breath out. She focused. She squeezed. The sharp clang of lead hitting tin was immediate and deeply satisfying. The can spun off the log. She turned to him, her eyes bright with a fierce, hot triumph. Gideon Vale was not a man for easy praise. He looked at the fallen tin, then at her. He gave a single, slow nod. Again, it was all the approval she needed. They established the rules of their small, shared world. Neither of their doors had locks, but a knock was always given, and a response was always waited for. It was a boundary of respect, stronger than any deadbolt. The evenings lengthened. The silence between them changed. It was no longer the sharp, angular silence of strangers, or the heavy, grieving silence Gideon had cultivated for 3 years. It became a comfortable, shared space. They ate simple dinners, venison stew, cornbread. She learned he disliked turnips. He learned she liked her coffee with a little sugar. a small luxury he procured on his next silent trip to town. They started to talk, small stories. She told him about the vet in Missouri, about learning to read from her mother's tattered copy of Shakespeare. He told her about the red roan, about the way Elspeth had planted the wild roses that still struggled by the porch, roses she had carried all the way from Ohio. They were not sharing their pain. They were sharing the pieces of themselves that existed before the pain. One night, late, Mara had gone to her room. Gideon was alone by the fire, stoking the embers before bed. The cabin was quiet. His gaze fell on the mantel. The photograph of Elspeth was there, a small tintype in a dark, simple wooden frame. It had sat in that exact spot for 3 years. Her face, young and smiling, was turned inward, watching the hearth, watching him, a constant, beloved, silent sentinel of his grief. He stood there for a long time. He heard, in his memory, the sound of Mara's laugh. He saw the pale blue of the curtains. He heard the clang of the tin can. His calloused, sure hand reached out. He picked up the photograph. He held it, his thumb brushing the glass. He felt the familiar, dull ache, but it was not sharp. It was not angry. He did not put it in a drawer. He did not hide it. He walked across the room to the main window, the one that looked out over the dark valley, toward the east, the one where Mara's pale blue curtains now hung, pulled back for the night. He set the frame on the wide windowsill. He turned it, so her face was no longer looking in at him, at the hearth, at the past. He turned it so she was looking out over the dark, sleeping land, out toward the rising sun. She was not a gate blocking the path. She was a memory, standing beside it, a witness. Gideon stood at the window, his hand resting on the cool wood of the frame. Outside, the endless Wyoming wind, which had howled and screamed for months, had finally softened. It was just a whisper now, moving through the high pines. The silence in the cabin was no longer sharp. It was full. The war began with water, and the absence of it. Gideon rode Ashen, the gray gelding that now followed him with a hard-won trust, up to the head of the creek. He had known what he would find, but the reality was a quiet, profound violence. The ditch was new, dug deep into the rocky soil, a raw wound in the earth. It was a professional job, angled perfectly to catch the main flow of the spring melt and send it east, toward the plume of smoke that marked the Calder stamp mill. Dry Creek was now, quite literally, dry. What was left was a muddy, stagnant trickle, not enough for a single cow, let alone a field of barley. He sat on the horse, his hands resting on the pommel, and stared at the diverted water. This was Calder's answer to the inked-out line. It was not a raid. It was not a bullet. It was a slow, legal strangulation. He could not prove this was Calder's work, not in a court. It was just a ditch on open land, but it was aimed at the heart of his ranch. He rode the fence line back, his eyes scanning. The grass, which should have been greening with the melt, was already showing a brittle, yellowish cast. The attacks grew bolder, but remained quiet, like a coyote testing a corral. 2 days later, he found the salt licks. They were placed far from his own, in a narrow ravine that led toward the mine's property. He did a count, 4 heifers, young ones from his best stock, gone, lured away, not driven. It was rustling, but done with a patience that was more insulting than a stampede. That evening, he checked the main horse barn. The heavy latch on the feed-room door, the one he always secured, was hanging loose. He looked closer. The wood around the hasp was splintered, the metal bent. Someone had put a pry bar to it. They had not taken anything. They had simply wanted him to know they could. They could get to his animals. They could get to his feed. They were inside his boundaries. Mara saw the change in him. The quiet, comfortable silence between them was gone, replaced by the old, sharp-edged quiet of a man listening. He spent his days riding the property line, his Winchester carbine never in its scabbard, but held across his lap. He ate his meals quickly, his gaze distant, his ears tuned to the outside. He knew they would be back. The man who pried the latch, the man who set the salt licks. He would return to see the effect of his work. Gideon did not wait in the house. 3 nights later, under a sliver of moon, he was not in his bed. He was lying flat on a ridge overlooking the new diversion ditch, wrapped in a dark wool blanket, perfectly still. The air was cold enough to make his breath plume, but he breathed shallowly. Through his teeth, he waited for 6 hours, just before the false dawn. When the darkness is at its thickest and coldest, he heard it. The scrape of a boot on rock, a single muffled cough. A figure emerged from the shadows. Leading a horse, the man walked to the ditch, knelt, and checked the flow. He seemed satisfied. He stood, turning to survey the valley below, his gaze lingering on the dark, sleeping shape of Gideon's ranch. Gideon moved, silent as a mountain lion. He was on the man in 10 paces. The cold, round mouth of the Winchester pressed hard against the base of his skull. "Don't move! Rook!" The man, Rook Dancy, a low-level tough from the mine, froze. His hands, which had been reaching for his own pistol, slowly went up. "It's a cold night to be checking water levels, ain't it? Vale!" Dancy's voice was a shaky rasp. "Drop the gun belt! Slow!" The belt thudded to the dirt. Gideon kicked it away. "What are you doing on my graze, Rook?" Just looking around. It's free land, ain't it?" "This water." Gideon jabbed the rifle barrel. "It feeds my ranch. Or it used to, before this ditch appeared. I don't know nothing about no ditch. Vale, I swear. Liar." Gideon reached into his own coat. He did not pull out rope. He pulled out the small, leather-bound ledger he had used at the mercantile. He pulled out a pencil. He pressed them into Dancy's chest. "What's this?" "Write what?" "Write what I tell you." Gideon's voice was like frozen iron. "Write, my name is Rook Dancy. On this day, March 29th, I was checking the ditch that my foreman, Jed Lyle, ordered me to dig." "I ain't writing that." "Lyle'll kill me." "I'll kill you right here," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And no one will find you till the buzzards get heavy. Write it." Rook Dancy's hand was shaking so badly the pencil lead snapped. Gideon, with a sigh of irritation, took it back, sharpened the tip with his pocket knife, and handed it back. "Right. Jed Lyle ordered me to divert the water from Dry Creek to harm Gideon Vale's ranch, on orders from me from Calder." I can't," Rook pleaded. Gideon cocked the rifle. The schlick-schlack of the lever was the loudest sound in the territory. Rook began to write, his letters large and clumsy in the graying light. When he was done, he held the ledger out, trembling. Gideon took it. He read the words. It was crude, but it was a confession. "Sign it." Rook signed his name. Gideon tore the page from the ledger, folded it, and put it in his breast pocket. Then he picked up Rook's gun belt. He handed it to the terrified man. Rook stared at him, confused. "You're a lackey. Rook, you're not the problem. You're just the symptom. Now, get off my land, and tell Jed Lyle that I have this. Tell him if I see so much as one of his men near my property again, I won't be in a mood for writing." Rook Dancy scrambled for his horse and fled, disappearing into the dawn. Gideon returned to the cabin as the sun was rising. Mara was at the stove, the coffee pot on. She looked at his face, saw the cold exhaustion, and knew he had not slept. She saw the folded paper he placed on the mantel, next to her own contract. "Trouble?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Leverage," he replied. He sat at the table, and for the first time, he let her pour his coffee. The leverage lasted 4 days. Calder and Lyle were too smart to be blackmailed. They did not send another man. They sent something else. It happened in the dead of night, in the deep. Heavy sleep just after 2 in the morning. Mara woke up. She was in the small pantry room, the cot comfortable, the door slightly ajar as it always was. She woke for no reason, a sound, a feeling, and then a smell. It was not the familiar smell of the wood stove. It was not pine or ash. It was acrid. It was hay. It was burning. She sat bolt upright, her heart stopping, then hammering. "No!" She threw off her blanket and ran into the main room. The hearth was embers. She ran to the window. The night was orange. The large hay barn, the one 50 yards from the main house, the one filled with their entire winter's feed for the new calves, was a roaring tower of flame. Sparks and burning straw were being carried on the night wind. A deadly rain, falling onto the dry shake roof of the main house. "Gideon!" she screamed, her voice tearing. She ran to his room, pounding on the door, violating the boundary for the first time. "Gideon, wake up, fire! The barn is on fire!" He was out in an instant, pulling on his boots, his mind already calculating. He burst out the front door and sized up the situation in a single, terrible glance. The hay barn was lost. A solid wall of flame was already eating the roof. The wind was from the north, blowing a blizzard of embers directly at the house and the main horse barn. "The roof!" he yelled. "The pump!" There was no time for thought, only action. They were a machine. He ran to the hand pump, his muscles screaming as he primed it and began to heave the handle. Clank, gush, clank, gush. Mara was there with the first bucket, filling it from the trough. "The house!" he shouted. "Soak the roof, then the barn go!" She ran, the heavy bucket sloshing, water dark in the firelight. She threw it with all her strength against the side of the cabin, the water hissing as it hit the hot shingles. She ran back. He was already there with the second bucket, and he ran for the horse barn, dousing the north wall, which was already steaming from the radiant heat. For 2 hours, they worked in the roaring, hellish light. It was a desperate, silent, lung-searing dance. He pumped, she ran, he ran, she filled. They did not speak. The only sounds were the fire's terrible, hungry roar, the crash of falling timbers, the rhythmic clank gush of the pump, and their own ragged sobbing breaths. They were soaked. They were choking on the thick, greasy smoke. Their arms felt like lead, but they did not stop. They were fighting for the ranch, bucket by bucket, just as the sky began to turn a sickly, smoky gray. The main roof of the hay barn collapsed inward with a final, explosive whoosh that sent a column of sparks into the dawn sky. The immediate threat was over. The structure was a blackened, smoking crater. The house was safe. The horse barn was safe. Gideon and Mara stood by the water trough, leaning on the pump, unable to move. They were both breathing in deep, ragged gulps, their faces black, their clothes soaked with a mixture of water and ash. "It's gone," Mara whispered, staring at the smoking ruin. "All of it, all the feed." Gideon just nodded, his chest heaving. He looked at the ruin. He looked at the house. He looked at the sky. Then he looked at her. Her hair was matted with soot and water. Her face was a mask of grime, except for the clean tracks where tears had run, mixing with the ash. There was a particularly dark streak across her left cheekbone. He acted without thinking. His body moved from a place of pure, exhausted instinct. He raised his hand, his fingers, rough and calloused, and gently, so gently, touched her cheek. He meant to wipe the soot away. His thumb brushed the soft skin beneath the grime. She went utterly still, her eyes wide and luminous in the smoky light, locked on his. She did not pull away. She did not lean in. She simply stopped breathing. In that touch, the boundary of soot and ash, of rescuer and survivor, of master and servant, evaporated. He felt the impossible softness of her skin, the warmth of her life beneath his hand. He saw the woman, not the victim. He realized what he was doing. The intimacy of the gesture in the cold, smoky dawn was more shocking than the fire itself. He snatched his hand back as if the skin he had touched was hot coal. You had soot," he stammered, his voice thick and hoarse. He turned away from her, grabbing a bucket and moving toward the horse barn, his movements suddenly clumsy. "I have to check the horses." The sheriff arrived at 10 o'clock. The smoke was still thick in the valley, a signal of disaster visible for miles. Lonnie Pike rode up slowly, his eyes taking in the smoldering skeleton of the barn, the water-soaked ground, the exhaustion on Gideon's face. "Heard you had a visitor," Pike said quietly. "Seems that way." Gideon said. He was leaning on a pitchfork, his eyes red-rimmed. "You know who did it." It was not a question. "I can't prove it." Pike nodded, his face grim. "Maybe you don't have to." He reached into his coat. He was not here to investigate the fire. He was a messenger. "Gideon, this came by wire this morning, from Cheyenne. It's official." He handed Gideon a folded paper. It was not a warrant. It was a summons. "Pierce Dalton, acting on behalf of Ephraim Calder," Pike said, reciting from memory, "has filed a civil suit in the territorial court. He's demanding the immediate return of contractual property." Gideon's eyes lifted from the paper. They were flat, cold, and dead tired. "He's asking the judge for an order of seizure," Pike continued, hating his own words, "to retrieve the person of one Mara Ellison." Gideon looked at the smoking ruin of his winter hay, his livelihood. He looked at the official paper in his hand. A small, thin, and infinitely dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Property," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You ride back to town. Lonnie, you tell that weasel Dalton. You tell him the only property here at Dry Creek is a pile of wet straw and some dry honor." He crumpled the summons in his fist. "He's welcome to try and seize either one." News of the fire and the summons hit Pine Hollow like a second thunderclap. Reverend Abigail, hearing the news as she dismissed her Sunday school, marched directly to Reed's Mercantile. She bought a new ledger and a bottle of ink. She did not wait for Sunday. She started that afternoon, going door to door, to the smithy, to the miners' cabins, to the ranches. She was not asking for opinions. She was gathering signatures, a petition to the territorial judge, decrying the service of person and body clause as an affront to God and the United States Constitution. "This is not about debt," she thundered at a hesitant baker. "It is about slavery in our valley." Mara stood on the porch of the cabin, the smell of smoke and wet ash filling her lungs. She held the crumpled summons in her hand, having smoothed it out on the table. She saw the blackened ruin. She saw the petition in Reverend Abigail's hand as she rode past the ranch gate. This was not about her anymore. She was no longer just running. Her simple act of survival had become the fuse, the fire, the stolen water, the petition. Gideon had made his stand. The town was being forced to make its own. She walked out to the smoking ruin where Gideon was sifting through the blackened hay with a pitchfork, salvaging nothing. "This is my fault," she said, her voice small, but not weak. "All this," he did not stop his work. "This was my choice. That fire was set by the same man who stole my water. It's not your fault, it's his. But I brought it here." She looked down at the paper in her hand, then back up, her eyes clear and hard. The fear that had lived in her for so long was finally gone, burned out by the fire, replaced by a cold, pure anger. "I will not hide in your kitchen anymore. I will not let you and that brave woman fight for me while I'm sheltered." She stepped forward, onto the edge of the ash. "He served a summons. I will answer it. I will not run again. I will face him in court." Gideon stopped. He lowered the pitchfork. He looked at her. He saw the soot still streaked on her face, but her chin was high. He saw the woman who had turned the breech calf, the woman who had hit the tin can, the woman who had fought the fire by his side all night. He gave that same slow nod, the one that meant approval, the one that meant respect. "We will." It was the night before they were to ride to Sweetwater. The world, after the violence of the fire and the raw scrape of the new ditch, had gone utterly still. A late, unseasoned snow had fallen during the day. Not a blizzard, but a soft, heavy blanket that muffled all sound, burying the ashes of the burned barn and turning the scarred land into a place of clean, profound, and simple white. The moon rose, nearly full, and the light it threw across the snow was so bright, so sterile, it was almost blue. Silver Butte Valley was not a ranch. It was a cathedral of silence. Inside the cabin, The air was thick with a different kind of quiet, a taut, humming tension. Gideon had spent the hour after supper checking the buckles on his saddle, oiling the action of his Winchester, and replacing the latch on the horse barn door that Rook Dancy had pried. Every action was precise, final, and heavy with meaning. Mara was in the main room, by the table. She had washed their supper dishes, and now she was packing a small canvas satchel. In it, she placed the folded, ink-stained contract. She added the crumpled, fire-singed summons. She folded Elspeth's flannel shirt, the one she had worn since her arrival, and placed it on top. She was leaving tomorrow, one way or another, to court, and what came after, no one knew. Gideon finished his work and came in, stamping the snow from his boots. He hung his heavy coat on the peg. He was restless, a caged bear. He watched her. She tied the satchel closed. Her hands were shaking, not with a tremor, but with a fine, deep vibration, as if a wire inside her were strung too tight. She finished, and then, having nothing left to do, she walked to the window, the one with the pale blue curtains she had sewn. She pulled one aside and looked out at the impossible, moonlit white. "It's so quiet," she whispered, her breath fogging the cold pain, "like the world is holding its breath." She was cold. He could see it. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the chill was coming from inside. Gideon stood by the hearth. He watched her for a long moment. The boundary between them, so carefully rebuilt after the instinctive touch in the smoky dawn, was still there. He had been so careful. He had given her space. He had been polite, distant, a guardian. But tonight, that felt like a lie. He turned to the wall, to the peg where his own coat hung. Next to it was another, a heavy, dark green wool cloak, lined with sheepskin. It was finer than his, and smaller, but it was heavy. It was Elspeth's, the one she had worn only in the deepest part of winter, or on long rides to Cheyenne. He had not touched it in 3 years. He took it down. The smell of cedar, from the chest where it had been stored, rose from it. He walked across the room. He did not speak. Mara did not turn, but she knew he was there. She sensed his shadow, his heat, his stillness. He lifted the heavy cloak and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it, the sudden, enveloping warmth, startled her. She gasped, a small, quiet sound. The cloak was huge on her, swallowing her. It smelled of him, of the cabin, of wood smoke and clean wool. It was an embrace, an armor. He did not move away. He had put the cloak on her, and his hands rested on her shoulders, the thick wool bunched in his grasp. He was standing just behind her, so close that the cold from the window was banished. The space between them, the respectful distance they had kept for weeks, vanished. It was gone, reduced to the span of a single, shared breath. He could feel the fine, uncontrollable tremor in her shoulders beneath his palms. "I'm afraid," she whispered to the glass, her voice so small he almost did not hear it. His hands tightened, a reflex of reassurance. "He won't get to you, not while I'm standing." "It's not him," she said, and her voice was stronger now, laced with a cold anger. "Not his face. I'm not afraid of him anymore. You burned that fear out of me. No, I'm afraid of the words." She turned, still inside the circle of his arms, the heavy cloak pooling around her. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. Her eyes, in the low lamplight, were dark, wide, and desperate. "I'm afraid of that courtroom," she said, her voice shaking. "Of the judge, of that lawyer, Dalton. They will use those words, Gideon, property, chattel, indentured. They will read that line, the one you struck out, and they will try to undo me. They will try to make me a thing again, a stack of paper. They'll erase me, right there, in front of everyone." Gideon looked down at her. His face was grim, his eyes holding hers. "Words are ink on paper. They're wind. We already fought the ink. We already fought the fire. This is just talking. But it's your name they'll erase, too," she insisted, her hands gripping the front of the cloak. gripping his shirt beneath it. "You heard the sheriff. They will take this ranch. They will ruin you. All of this. All because you didn't let me freeze to death. You'll lose everything." His gaze did not waver. He was silent for a long, heavy beat. The only sound was the snap of the pine logs in the hearth. "I already lost everything," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. 3 years ago, I put Elspeth in the ground, and I put myself in there with her. I forgot to stop walking." The confession hung in the air. A raw, exposed nerve. "For 3 years," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "This ranch wasn't a home. It was a grave I had to feed. It was a place to wait. The silence. It was so loud. Then you fell out of the storm. You brought noise back. You brought bread and fire and that damn blue cloth." He looked at the curtains, then back at her. "When that hay barn was burning, I wasn't afraid. I was angry. I was awake. I haven't been awake in 3 years. Mara." He took a breath. And the truth of it, the final, terrifying truth, came out. "This is the first thing I've fought for. This is the first time I've felt alive. My fear, it's not the same as yours." His hands slid from her shoulders to frame her face, his rough palms cupping her jaw. "I'm not afraid of losing this ranch. I'm afraid of winning. I'm afraid of winning this fight in that courtroom, and you leaving. I'm afraid you'll get on that eastbound stage, and the silence. It'll come back, and I'm afraid," his voice cracked, "just once, of loving something again, of finally loving something, just to watch it be taken away." She stared at him, her world tilting. He was not the stoic protector. He was not the immovable guardian. He was a man, terrified and grieving, standing in the ruins of his life, admitting that she was the one thing he could not bear to lose. He was asking, his eyes dark and filled with this new, terrible vulnerability, dropped from her eyes, to her mouth, and back to her eyes. He was not Calder. He was not a man who took. He was a man who asked, even without words. Mara's answer was not a word. It was a breath, a release of all the fear, all the tension. Her eyes, which had been wide with panic, softened. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She rose up on her toes, just an inch, and closed her eyes. He met her halfway. The kiss was not a crash of passion. It was a slow, deliberate, and profound arrival. It was a confirmation. His lips, chapped from the wind, were surprisingly gentle. It was a kiss of questions, of discovery, of utter, grounding certainty. It was slow, and it was sure. It tasted of the cold night air, of coffee, of the wood smoke that clung to him like skin. She did not cling to him. Her hands, which had been clutching his shirt, rose. She laid one hand, palm flat, on the solid, hard wall of his chest. Beneath her hand, she felt it, the heavy, steady, powerful thump-thump of his heart. It was not racing. It was strong. It was the rhythm of the post driver, of the pump handle, of life itself. His other hand, the one not cradling her face, found her free hand. He captured it. He was not holding it, but enveloping it. He turned it over, his gaze dropping to her palm, then to her wrist. The ink stain was there, a pale, blue-gray ghost of her bondage. Gideon looked at it. His thumb, calloused and dark from work, slowly, deliberately, swept over the faded mark. He covered it completely. His hand was a shield, a warmth. His touch was not one of possession. It was a silent, physical vow. This is not you. This will not define you. I will not let it. He did not pull her closer. He did not deepen the kiss. He pulled back, just enough to rest his forehead against hers. They stood there, in the middle of the quiet cabin, their breaths mingling, the moonlight and the firelight painting their joined shadow, tall and singular, on the log wall. They were both shaking now. Their clothes were proper, their bodies decent, but the connection was so intense it was almost electric. The heat, the shared understanding, the sheer, burning trust was more intimate than any nakedness. He led her, not to his bed or to hers, but to the hearth, to the worn, bear-pelt rug where he had first laid her, a frozen, half-dead stranger. They sat, side by side, their shoulders, hips, and knees pressed together. He kept the heavy green cloak wrapped around them both, a shared blanket. They stared into the fire, its orange light flickering on their faces. They sat that way for a long time, listening to the fire, to the profound, snow-blanketed silence of the world outside. They did not speak of the court. They did not speak of Calder. "When the creek flows again," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I'm going to plant the barley in the lower pasture, the soil. It holds the water better there." Mara leaned her head against his shoulder. It felt solid, like the mountain. "You'll need a garden," she said, her voice quiet, almost sleepy. "For the house, corn, and pole beans, and tomatoes, if the frost holds off long enough." "The chicks," Gideon said, a small, rusty smile in his voice. "The ones I ordered from Reed, the ones he said he couldn't sell me. I think Reverend Abigail has them. She rode by yesterday, said she was holding a package for me at the church." "A garden," Mara whispered. Her hand, which he was still holding, tightened on his. "And new chickens." They were not talking about farming. They were building a future, right here, in the ashes of the past. They were planting a seed of after. The fire burned down to glowing red embers. The moon had crossed the sky and was now setting behind the western ridge. The cabin grew cooler. Gideon stirred, the movement reluctant. "You need to sleep. Tomorrow. Tomorrow is a long ride." He stood, his joints stiff. He pulled her gently to her feet. The heavy cloak fell away, pooling at her feet. They stood at the door to her small room, the boundary they had respected for so long. The tension was back, but it was not fear. It was the shared, electric hum of partners on the eve of a battle. He looked down at her, and his face, usually so harsh and carved with grief, was transformed. He smiled, a real, open, unguarded smile. She smiled back. It was not the smile of a victim. It was not a smile of gratitude. It was the smile of an equal, a partner. There were no flowery promises. There was no "I love you." There was no need. They had made a different kind of vow, a stronger one, forged in fire and sealed in the quiet, a simple, unspoken agreement to face the truth, together. "Good night, Mara," he said. "Good night, Gideon." She stepped back into her room and closed the door. Gideon stood in the main room, his hand still warm from hers. He looked at the window, at Elspeth's picture, which was now just a silhouette against the fading moonlight. Outside, the wind that had been the soundtrack to his grief for 3 years was gone. The valley was silent. It was holding its breath, waiting for the dawn. They did not ride to Sweetwater the next day. The summons, Gideon had explained, was a threat, not a transport. It was a paper tiger meant to make them bolt. The judge would not see them for weeks. Not until the spring session was formally opened. They had been given a gift time. The cabin at Dry Creek, which had been a refuge, then a home, now became a war room. The pine table, scarred by knives and flour, became their strategy board. Gideon rode to Pine Hollow, not with a rifle, but with a list. He went first to the telegraph office, a small, noisy closet off the side of the Mercantile. He sent a priority wire to the territorial court clerk in Monument Springs, the county seat. The message was simple, urgent. Request confirmation, probate filing. Estate of Arthur Ellison, died Pine Hollow vicinity. January 1891. Respond Dry Creek Ranch, paid. The operator, a young man with a green visor, took his money. Might be a day, Mr. Vale. I'll wait, Gideon said. He did not wait at the Mercantile. He went to the church. Reverend Abigail was in the rectory. A small, neat room smelling of old books and lemon tea. Her petition lay on the desk, a damning scroll of names. They're afraid. Gideon, she said, her voice sharp. I got 32 names the first day, yesterday. 3 asked to have their names struck. Calder's foreman, Lyle, was in the mercantile, making a list of who bought from whom. He cut the credit for anyone who signed. We need more than names, Gideon said. We need facts. You hear things. Reverend, you know the books. Calder's books. She gave a dry laugh. They're sealed tighter than a coffin. But the town's books. They began to work. They pulled the last 2 years of mercantile ledgers, which Reed Holloway reluctantly provided. They cross-referenced invoices from the Calder Mining Company. Look at this, Gideon said, his finger on a line. Jed Lyle. He signs for everything. Company dynamite, company timber, company wages. He's the foreman, Abigail said. He's also the proxy on Mara's contract. Gideon reminded her. He's acting as a private citizen in one room, and the company paymaster in the next. The line is blurred. It's fraud. They found other names, miners who had taken advances, signing wage assignments that were, in their own way, indentures. They were finding a pattern of abuse. The telegraph key began chattering. Gideon walked back to the office. The operator handed him the yellow slip. It read, No record. Arthur Ellison, Monument Springs probate. Stop. No executor named. No filing. Stop. Gideon folded the slip and put it in his breast pocket. It was the first piece of iron. The entire contract, the $900 debt, was built on a legal fiction. Jed Lyle had no more authority to sign for Arthur's estate than a passing stranger. He rode back to Dry Creek, the paper warm against his chest. He found Mara not at the stove, but at the table. The contract spread out under the lamplight. She was not looking at it with fear. She was looking at it with the cold, focused anger of an accountant who had found a discrepancy. Gideon, she said, her voice tight. This seal, the lawyer's seal, Pierce Dalton. I see it. Look at the date, she pointed. February 10th, 1891. It's the date on the contract. Yes, she said. But I was thinking, my uncle died. I got the letter. I had to sell my mother's furniture to buy a train ticket from St. Louis. She stood and went to the small pantry room, returning with a battered leather satchel. She dug inside, past her few remaining possessions, and pulled out a small, dog-eared piece of pasteboard. The train, she said, her hand shaking, was delayed by snow in Nebraska. I was on that train for 6 days. I remember it. I remember the date I arrived. She placed the ticket on the table next to the contract. I arrived in Pine Hollow on the 14th of February. Valentine's Day? I remember because the saloon was so loud. Gideon stared from the ticket to the contract. You arrived on the 14th. I met with Calder and Dalton on the 15th, she said, her voice rising with the force of the discovery. That is the day I signed, but the contract is dated the 10th, 5 days before I was even in the Wyoming territory. Gideon understood. It was not just a mistake. It was a deliberate, fraudulent backdating. They had prepared the document, including the false authority from Jed Lyle, days in advance, sealing it with a date when the primary signatory was 1,000 miles away. They weren't just taking advantage of you, Gideon said, the pieces clicking into place. They were building a trap. They had this ready before you even stepped off the train. The second piece of iron. The third came in the dark. Gideon was in the horse barn, checking on the new calf, when a sound made him turn. Rook Dancy was standing in the shadows, his face pale, his hands shaking. Get off my land. Rook, Gideon said, his hand going to the axe handle, not the rifle. I ain't here for trouble. Vale, I swear. Dancy was terrified. You gotta help me. I'm not in the business of helping. It's Lyle, Dancy whispered, stepping into the lamplight. He knows I talked to you. He knows you got my confession. He's gonna pin the fire on me. He said if anyone asks, I was the one who bought the oil. He's gonna feed me to Calder. He probably will, Gideon said, his voice cold. I can prove it, Dancy pleaded, his voice cracking. I can prove it was him. His order. Look. He fumbled inside his jacket and pulled out a crumpled, greasy piece of paper. He threw it on the hay bale. I took it from the spike in the mercantile. It's the charge slip. Lyle's own signature. Gideon picked it up. It was a bill from Reed's Mercantile, dated the day before the fire, to Calder Mining. Stamp mill account. For 10 gallons kerosene, 1 sack, signed J. Lyle, 10 gallons. Enough to light the mine lamps for a month. Or to soak the foundation of a dry hay barn. It was the match. It was the proof. Why give this to me? Gideon asked. His eyes narrow. 'Cause you'll use it, Rook said. You'll take Lyle down. And when you do, you tell him I helped. You tell him I was the one who gave you this. You tell him my confession, he pointed to Gideon's pocket, was 'cause I was scared of him, not 'cause I was guilty of the fire. You gotta, please. Gideon looked at the desperate, sweating man. He folded the slip and put it next to the telegraph. Get out of here, Rook, and don't let me see you again. The fourth piece was the most delicate. The bruises on Mara's arm had long since faded, but their memory was a ghost in the room. Gideon rode to town and made one more stop. Not to the church, to the small office on the second floor of the bank, which read, Dr. May Lockwood, physician-surgeon. Doctor. Lockwood was a small, sharp woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She, like Reverend Abigail, was one of the few people in the valley who did not owe Ephraim Calder a single cent. She's agreed to be seen, Doctor, Lockwood asked, washing her hands in a porcelain basin. She has, Gideon said, standing by the window. He had brought Mara with him. She was sitting on the examination stool, her hands clasped, pale but resolute. Good. Gideon, you'll wait outside. He left. The door closed. He heard the low, steady murmur of the doctor's voice, and Mara's quieter replies. He paced the hall for 20 minutes. The door opened. Mara came out, her face calm. She looked at him and nodded. Doctor. Lockwood stood in the doorway, drying her hands. Mr. Vale, the young woman is healthy, but I have prepared a sworn medical affidavit based on her testimony and the lingering subcutaneous discoloration. The contusions, as she described them, were deep. The cycle of healing, the yellowing she described, is consistent with injuries sustained approximately 2 weeks before she arrived at your ranch, not after. She handed him a sealed envelope. It counters any claim that you are the source of the injuries. It places the violence squarely at the time of the contract's signing. The fourth piece. Sheriff Lonnie Pike found them at the ranch 2 days later. He did not come with a warrant. He came with a ledger of his own. Gideon, he said, accepting a cup of coffee at the table. The town is coming apart. The mine laid off 12 men this morning. The wives of 6 of them signed Abigail's petition. This is getting ugly. It was always ugly. Lonnie. Gideon said, it was just quiet. I've been asked to serve this. He laid another paper on the table. An injunction, preventing Gideon from interfering with the diversion ditch, as it was now part of a pending civil action. So he steals my water, then uses the law to keep it. Gideon summarized. That's about the size of it. Pike sighed, looking into his coffee. But that's not why I'm here. The judge. He's set a preliminary hearing, not the full trial, but a hearing. In Sweetwater, 3 days from now. He wants to see this contract, and he wants to see her. We'll be there, Mara said from the hearth. Pike looked at the collection of papers on Gideon's desk. The telegraph, the ticket, the greasy kerosene bill. You're building a war, Gideon. I'm building a case, Gideon corrected. Maybe. Pike stood, placing his hat on his head. I am an officer of the court. I am required to log any evidence pertinent to the hearing. You give me your sworn statements and copies of your findings, and I will log them as evidence. I'll present them to the judge. I'll do it by the book. It was as close to help as Lonnie Pike could get. It was a promise of neutrality, a promise that her proof would not be lost or misplaced on the road to Sweetwater. That night, Gideon did not ride. He did not oil his gun. He went to his workshop. He found a piece of wood, a slab of dry, hard locust, tough and resilient. He planed it smooth. He worked by lantern light. His hands sure. He was a carpenter again. He cut the pieces. his saw moving with a clean, sure rhythm. He dovetailed the corners. He built a box. It was simple, strong, and perfect. It was not a coffin, it was a chest. He spent an hour carving a single word into the lid. Truth. He did not have a new lock. He went into the house, to the cedar chest under the window where Elspeth's things were kept, her wedding dress, her lace, and on a small leather strap, the old brass lock that had secured her hope chest, the one she had brought from Ohio. He took the lock. He took the key. He returned to the workshop. He fitted the hasp to the locust box. He clicked the old brass lock into place. He brought the box into the cabin and set it on the table. Mara looked at it, her fingers tracing the carved letters. We put it all in here. Gideon said, the telegraph, the ticket, the doctor's report, the mercantile bill. He laid Rook Dancy's original, shaky confession in the box. He laid his own affidavit, his own sworn testimony of the night he found her, and the words he had struck from the page. Then he looked at Mara. He pushed the box, the inkwell, and a clean sheet of paper toward her. Now, you. She sat at the table, the same table where she had been given soup and a knife, the same table where she had discovered the lie. Her hand trembled. She dipped the pen. She held it over the paper, the ink heavy on the nib. Then she began to write. The tremor in her hand did not stop, but the letters she formed were clear, strong, and precise. She did not write as a victim. She wrote as a witness. She told of her uncle's death, of the summons from Calder, of the room with the two men, of the pen being forced into her hand, of the lie about house service, of the terror and the flight and the storm. She finished with one clear, defiant sentence. I am not chattel. I am not property. I am Mara Ellison, a citizen of the United States, and I ask the court for justice. She signed her name. She blew on the ink, folded the paper, and placed it in the box on top of all the others. Gideon closed the lid. He slid the brass pin of Elspeth's lock through the hasp. He pushed it shut. The click of the lock was loud and final in the quiet room. He turned the key. He gave the key, not to Gideon, but to Mara. She closed her hand around it. It was cold and heavy. It was the key to her past and her future. The town of Pine Hollow held its breath, smelling the change on the wind. The miners were quiet. Their loyalties split. They feared Calder's wages, but they saw their own wives, their own daughters, in the story of the woman at Dry Creek. The war of paper was over. The war of words was about to begin. The courtroom was not in Cheyenne. It was a temporary chamber, set up in the back room of the Sweetwater County Land Office. It was a room that smelled of cold iron, wet wool, and old paper. Long wooden benches, scarred with the carved initials of bored ranchers, were packed tight. A single pot-bellied stove in the corner ticked and hissed, fighting a losing battle against the cold that radiated from the tall, frosted windows. At the front, on a raised platform, sat Judge Horatio Bell. He was a man carved from granite, with a thick gray beard and eyes that had seen too many land disputes and cattle feuds to be impressed by anything. Mara and Gideon sat on the front bench. Gideon was a solid, unmoving block of dark wool, his hands resting on the locust box in his lap, the box carved with the word truth. Mara sat beside him, her back impossibly straight, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She wore the blue calico dress, mended and clean, and Elspeth's heavy green cloak. The room was split. On the right, the miners, saloon men, and suppliers loyal to Calder, led by a smirking Jed Lyle. On the left, Reverend Abigail, Dr. May Lockwood, Reed Holloway, and a handful of nervous, defiant ranchers and miners' wives who had signed the petition. In the back, standing, was Rook Dancy, his eyes wide, looking more like a trapped rabbit than a witness. Sheriff Lonnie Pike stood by the door, his face neutral, his hand resting on the jamb, not his gun. This court is in session, Judge Bell stated, his voice a gravelly rumble that cut through the coughing and shuffling. Case 81C, Calder versus Vale, regarding a civil contract of indenture. Mr. Dalton, you may begin. Pierce Dalton, the lawyer, rose. He was a slick, narrow man in an expensive Eastern suit. He relished the stage. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter," Dalton began, his voice smooth and condescending. "A matter of a signed, legal, and binding contract. A contract Mr. Gideon Vale has seen fit to violate, depriving my client, Mr. Ephraim Calder, of his rightful property." Calder himself, a thick, bull-necked man with a florid face and eyes like chips of ice, sat behind Dalton, watching Mara. "The contract is clear," Dalton continued. He held up his own pristine, filed copy. "I draw the court's attention to paragraph 4. In return for the cancellation of said debt, the signatory does pledge the full service." He paused for dramatic effect, his voice dropping. "Of person and body." He let the words hang in the air. "A physical, ugly thing. Service of person and body, signed, sealed, and witnessed. Yet, Mr. Vale, in an act of vigilante arrogance, has harbored this debtor. He has refused the lawful requests of Sheriff Pike. He has, in effect, stolen my client's property. We demand an immediate order of seizure. We demand the woman, Mara Ellison, be remanded to the custody of Mr. Calder to fulfill her legal obligation." He sat down. The room was silent. Judge Bell looked at the other side. "Mr. Vale, you are not a lawyer. You may, however, speak as a citizen and as the defendant in this matter." Gideon Vale stood. He did not look at Dalton. He looked at the judge. He was not a man of slick words. His voice was the rumble of rock. "Your Honor, my name is Gideon Vale. I am a citizen of this territory, and I am the keeper of the evidence." He stepped forward and placed the locust box. "Truth on the witness table." The heavy wood thudded against the pine. A murmur went through the room. "This is not a matter of a broken contract," Gideon said. "This is a matter of a criminal fraud." "Objection!" Dalton leaped to his feet. "This is a civil hearing, slander. There is no proof of any fraud." "Then let us look at the contract," Gideon said, his voice calm. He turned to Mara. "The key." Mara stood. Her hand was shaking, but she walked to the box. She inserted the key, the small brass key from Elspeth's hope chest. She turned it. The click of the lock opening was sharp and loud. She raised the lid. Gideon reached inside and took out the original document, Mara's copy, the one she had carried through the storm. He did not hand it to the judge. He held it up for the entire room to see. The room gasped. There, on the paper, were the thick, angry, black slashes of ink. The words, "service of person and body," were obliterated, struck out, and in the margin was Gideon's own clear, strong signature, witnessing the act. "He's defaced it," Dalton shrieked, his face purple. "Your Honor, did you see that he has willfully, maliciously destroyed legal evidence? He has destroyed the contract itself. I demand he be held in contempt. I demand this hearing be ruled in our favor immediately." Judge Bell leaned forward. His eyes narrowed, his displeasure a cold front rolling into the room. "Mr. Vale, you admit you did this. I admit I struck a line that no man has a right to write, and no court has a right to enforce." Gideon said. "He has voided the document," Dalton hammered. "It is destroyed." "No," Gideon said, his voice cutting through the lawyer's screech. "It is not." He locked eyes with Dalton. "You see, Mr. Dalton, I am a rancher. I know the value of a good piece of paper. The original, intact contract, just as Miss Ellison received it, was notarized by Mr. Reed Holloway, who is present, and lodged for safekeeping with the postmaster at Silver Butte before I made this correction. The pristine text is preserved and on record, should the court wish to see it." Dalton's mouth opened and closed. He had been outmaneuvered. "This," Gideon continued, holding up the marked paper, "this is my answer to the contract. This is my sworn affidavit, made in ink, and this," he gestured to the open, waiting box. "This is the truth." And the evidence began to fall. "Mr. Dalton claims this contract is legal." Gideon reached in and pulled out the telegraph slip. I present a telegram from the Monument Springs Probate Court. It confirms there was never any probate filing for the estate of Arthur Ellison. There was no executor. The man who signed as proxy, Mr. Jed Lyle, he stared at the foreman, had no legal right to do so. The debt was never legally transferred. The contract is a fraud from its first word. Jed Lyle went pale. Mr. Dalton claims Miss Ellison signed this on February 10th. Gideon pulled out the small pasteboard train ticket. I present a ticket from the Union Pacific Railroad, showing Miss Ellison was in the state of Nebraska on that day. She did not arrive in Pine Hollow until the 14th. The document was fraudulently dated and sealed. Pierce Dalton began to stack his papers, his hands shaking. Mr. Dalton claims this is a simple matter of a runaway servant. Gideon pulled out the greasy, crumpled kerosene bill. I present a charge slip from the Mercantile, signed by Jed Lyle, for 10 gallons of kerosene, the day before my hay barn was burned to the ground. An act of violent intimidation. He pulled out Rook Dancy's shaky, signed confession, and I present the testimony of the man who dug the ditch that is strangling my ranch, a man who will testify he did so on Lyle's orders, to smoke Vale out. He pulled out Dr. Lockwood's sealed affidavit and Reverend Abigail's petition, signed by 32 citizens. And finally, Gideon said, his voice filling the room, I present Miss Ellison's own testimony. He laid the last paper down. This is not property. This is a person. And this is not a contract. It is a cage. And we are here to ask you, Your Honor, to open it. A profound, stunned silence filled the room. Judge Bell looked at the mountain of evidence on the table. He looked at the face of Pierce Dalton, who was now just a deflated suit. He looked at Ephraim Calder. Calder's face was no longer pale. It was a dark, congested purple. He stood up slowly, his heavy chair scraping the floor. This is an outrage. Calder boomed, his voice a bellow of pure, unchecked power. This is my valley. I built that town. I pay those wages. That contract was a simple arrangement. I paid good money. He forgot himself. He forgot the judge. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at Mara. I bought her, he roared, the raw, ugly truth finally erupting. I bought that woman with my own gold. She belongs to me. The room exploded. The miners' wives, the ranchers, even some of the men loyal to Calder, surged to their feet. Shame, cried Reverend Abigail. Shame. Judge Bell grabbed his gavel and smashed it on the desk. Order, order, Mr. Calder. You will sit, you will be silent, or I will have the sheriff remove you. Calder, his eyes wide, seemed to realize what he had said. He sank back into his chair, his breath heavy. Judge Bell looked at the evidence. He looked at Calder's self-incriminating rage. He did not need to deliberate. This is a preliminary hearing, the judge said, his voice a cold, flat iron. But sufficient evidence has been presented to warrant immediate action. First, the clause service of person and body is found to be contrary to the statutes of this territory and the Constitution of the United States. It is immoral. It is illegal. And it is hereby struck. It is void. Mara let out a breath she had been holding for months. Second, due to the overwhelming evidence of fraud, including proxy fraud, fraudulent dating, and witness intimidation, the entire contract is hereby suspended, pending a full criminal investigation into the actions of Mr. Pierce Dalton and Mr. Jed Lyle. Dalton looked as if he'd been shot. Third, the judge said, his eyes locking on Calder. Given the admission of the plaintiff and the evidence of violence, this court issues an immediate order of cessation. Mr. Calder, you and your employees are forbidden from approaching, contacting, or interfering with Miss Ellison, Mr. Vale, or the Dry Creek Ranch in any way. You will restore the water to that creek. Is that understood? Finally, the judge said, this hearing is adjourned. He smashed the gavel. It was over, or it seemed to be. Gideon packed the evidence back into the box. Mara closed the lid. He put his hand on her back, a simple, solid pressure. It's done. They walked out of the courtroom, into the cold, bright afternoon. The crowd spilled out behind them. And then, the trap. Jed Lyle and 3 of Calder's thick-necked pit foremen were waiting at the bottom of the steps. They had not been in the courtroom for the final ruling. They were blocking the boardwalk. "Mr. Calder wants to see the girl," Lyle sneered. His confidence returned. "Now." "Get out of the way, Lyle," Gideon said, his voice flat. He moved, putting himself between Lyle and Mara. "The judge ain't here now. Veil," Lyle said, and his hand moved to the heavy wrench tucked in his belt. The other men fanned out. They were going to take her, right here, in front of everyone. They were going to prove that Calder's law was the only one that mattered. "Sheriff!" Reverend Abigail screamed. Lyle lunged. He was not expecting Gideon's speed. Gideon did not throw a punch. He used his shoulder, a solid block of bone and muscle, and drove it straight into Lyle's solar plexus. The air left the foreman in a sick whoosh, and he folded. The other 2 men grabbed for Gideon. "No!" A line of men suddenly appeared, forming a solid wall. It was not just Gideon's allies. It was the Cornish miner, Tam, and 3 others from the petition, and at the front of them, his hand finally, decisively, on the butt of his revolver, was Sheriff Lonnie Pike. "That's enough," Pike said, his voice clear and cold. "The judge issued an order. You heard it. You're done. You're taking his side," one of the miners stammered, looking at Pike. "I'm taking the side of the law," Pike said. "The judge just spoke. And in Sweetwater County, what the judge says goes. Now back off, all of you." The foreman looked at Pike. They looked at the angry, defiant faces of the townsfolk. They looked at Lyle, who was still on the ground. Gagging, they backed away, their hands empty. Gideon looked at Sheriff Pike. Pike met his gaze and gave a single, curt nod. The law. Gideon turned, the adrenaline still singing in his veins. He looked at Mara. Her face was pale, but she was not cowering. Her eyes were on him. He held out his hand. She looked at his calloused, scarred palm, the hand that had pulled her from the snow, the hand that had held hers through the birth of the calf, the hand that had crossed out the line. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm. He did not let go. He held her hand and led her through the parting crowd. The townsfolk, his allies, and his enemies, all stepped aside, watching them. He led her past the sheriff, past the church, past the saloons. He led her to the wagon. He lifted her up to the seat, then climbed up beside her. He did not let go of her hand. He picked up the reins with his free hand and slapped them on the horse's rumps. The wagon moved, pulling away from the town, away from the court. Heading home, they rode, hand in hand. The air was cold, and it smelled of pine and damp earth and melting snow. It smelled like freedom. They rode back to Dry Creek not as victors, but as survivors who had drawn a new map, the locust box. Truth sat between them on the wagon seat. The journey was slow, the mud deep. But as they crested the final ridge and the valley opened up, a new sound reached them, carried on the clear, cold air. It was the sound of running water. The diversion ditch had been broken. Per the judge's order, Sheriff Pike had overseen the work himself, and now the full, muscular force of the spring melt was surging down the dry bed of the creek. It was a loud, churning, vital roar. It was the sound of a pardon. Spring arrived at Dry Creek not as a gentle season, but as a sudden, passionate release. The land, starved for so long, drank greedily. The brittle yellow grass turned a deep, impossible green in a matter of days. The wild roses by the porch, the ones Elspeth had planted, exploded in a riot of pale pink blossoms. The air, which had smelled of smoke and ash, now smelled of wet earth, pine resin, and life. Their work, which had been a grim battle for survival, transformed. Gideon was no longer defending a perimeter. He was building a future. He took the seed he had bought with Elspeth's gold and, with Mara walking beside him, they planted the lower pasture, the rich soil dark and promising. Mara changed, too. The fear was gone, and the quiet anger had softened into a powerful, steady purpose. She was no longer just the cook, the partner in survival. she became a force in the valley. The miners' wives, the ones who had signed Abigail's petition, began to visit. They came in small, shy pairs, bringing eggs or a small jar of preserves, their eyes still wary of Calder's retribution. They came to thank Gideon, but they stayed to talk to Mara. She saw their daughters, young girls with watchful eyes and hands already rough from chores. She saw herself in them. She cleaned out the old tack room in the horse barn, the one that smelled of leather and axle grease. She whitewashed the walls and convinced Gideon to build 2 simple benches. She started a class, twice a week. 6 young girls from the mining camps would walk the 2 miles to Dry Creek. Mara taught them their letters, using old mercantile catalogs and Gideon's copy of the Farmer's Almanac. But mostly, she taught them needlework. Not just mending. She brought out her own pale blue calico scraps and taught them embroidery. She taught them how to stitch flowers and stars and, most importantly, how to stitch their own names. She was teaching them to sign their own identity, to claim themselves, in a way she had never been allowed to. Gideon watched this from a distance. He saw the small, bright gathering in his barn, heard the murmur of voices and the occasional burst of laughter. His ranch, once a monument to silence, was now a school. He, too, was building. One morning, he took his axe and went to the small stand of birch trees by the creek. He worked for 3 days. Mara heard the steady, rhythmic thwack of the axe, the rasp of the plane. He was not mending fences. He dismantled the small, square pine table that had been the center of the cabin, the table where he had eaten alone for 3 years, the table where Mara had first woken, the table where they had laid out the terms of their truce, and later, the evidence for their war. It was a table of survival, and it was too small. He replaced it with the one he had built. It was a long, beautiful, heavy table made of pale, smooth birch. It was 10 feet long, wide, and solid. It was not a table for one man's grief. It was a table for a harvest. It was a table for many chairs, for community, for a future that was no longer empty. That night, they ate their simple dinner of venison and cornbread at the new table. The space between them felt different, open. After the dishes were cleared, the cabin was still. The only sounds were the crackle of the hearth and, from outside, the faint, high cheep, cheep, cheep of new life. Reverend Abigail had, as Gideon suspected, delivered the crate of chicks, and they were now living in a warm, hay-filled box by the stove. Gideon sat at one end of the new table. Mara sat at the other. He looked at the long, pale expanse of wood between them. "This table, it's too big," he said, his voice quiet. "It's not," Mara replied, her hands resting on the wood. "It's a table for planting, not just for winter." Gideon nodded. He stood, went to the locust box. Truth, which now sat on the mantel. He did not unlock it. He went to his desk and retrieved the copy of the contract, the one with the black, angry ink of his defiance. He brought it back to the new table and unrolled it in the center, under the warm glow of the kerosene lamp. The paper looked old and ugly on the clean. New wood. This, he said, was for the old table, a document of debt, of service. He picked up the pen in the inkwell. He looked at Mara. His eyes were steady, his face serious. He dipped the pen. He did not look at the line he had already struck. He moved to the very top, to the title, Indenture of Service, with one slow, deliberate stroke. He drew a line through the word servant. The scratch of the nib was loud in the quiet. Then, above it, in the same clear, strong hand he had used to sign his name in the margin, he wrote a new word, partner. He set the pen down. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. Calder, his way is to buy, to own, to take. Gideon's voice was a low, rough rumble. I don't have that way. He reached into his pocket. He did not pull out a ring of gold. He pulled out a simple, thin leather thong, the kind used for a saddle string. Tied to it was a small, dark object. It was a piece of hardwood, carved and smoothed, no bigger than her thumb. It was carved in the perfect, simple shape of a horseshoe. He laid it on the table, next to the contract. "I can't buy you. Mara, I won't. I'm not saving you. You saved yourself. You saved me." He slid the small, carved horseshoe across the smooth wood until it rested by her hand. "I'm inviting you. I'm inviting you to co-own this life, this ranch, this table." His voice was thick. "To be a full partner in all of it, the planting, the harvests, the winters. Will you?" Mara looked at the contract, at the new word, partner, gleaming in the wet ink. She looked at the simple, carved, wooden charm. She did not cry. All the tears had been burned out of her by fire, or frozen by the snow. A sound built in her chest, a sound of such profound, impossible relief that it broke free as a quiet laugh. It was a laugh of pure, astonished joy. She looked up at him, her face radiant. She did not reach for the charm. She stood, walked the length of the new table, and stood in front of him. She reached out and took his hand. No, not his hand. She took his wrist. Her fingers wrapped around the pale, faded band of skin where his own wedding ring had rested for a decade. She held him, claiming him, covering his past with her present. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." He stood, pulling her gently toward him. He did not crush her in an embrace. He did not pull her into the shadows. He stood in the warm lamplight, and he simply held her. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. She could feel the slight tremble in his calloused hands, which rested on her waist. "Mara," he breathed, his breath warm, mingling with hers. "Gideon," she replied. His lips brushed hers. It was not the kiss they had shared on the eve of the trial, a kiss of fear and desperation. This was a kiss that was light, dry, and infinitely warm. It was a press of promise, a seal. It was not a demand. It was a welcome. They stood, foreheads touching, simply breathing each other's air. A single, shared silhouette in the warm room. The cheep, cheep, cheep from the box by the stove grew louder, more insistent, demanding. Gideon pulled back, and the smile that broke across his face was one she had never seen, one of pure, unguarded happiness. "Life," he said, gesturing to the box. "It's loud, and it's hungry." "And it's lovely," she replied, her hand still holding his wrist. He tied the leather thong around her neck, the small wooden horseshoe settling in the hollow of her throat. It was warmer than any diamond. She turned with him, and they looked at the window, the one with the blue curtains, the one that faced the east. The tintype of Elspeth was there, watching the dark valley. In the polished, dark glass, the lamplight from behind them cast their reflection. They were two shadows, standing close, merged into one, and their reflection stood right beside the photograph of the woman who had come before. It was not a replacement. It was a blessing. A sharp knock came at the door. Gideon and Mara startled, their hands finding each other. The old reflex. Trouble. Gideon opened the door. It was not Lyle. It was not Calder. It was the mail rider from Sweetwater, his horse blowing hard. "Mr. Vale," the man said, tipping his hat to Mara. "Got a letter for you, from the judge's clerk. Came by special wire." Gideon took the envelope. He tore it open by the lamplight. Mara read it over his shoulder. It was not a long letter. It announced that the criminal trial of Ephraim Calder, Pierce Dalton, and Jed Lyle, on charges of fraud, conspiracy, arson, and witness intimidation, was set. The final date, the legal revenge, the final stroke that would break Calder's power or their own, had a name and a day. The fight was not over. But now, they knew. They would face it as partners. The second courtroom session was not a hearing. It was a reckoning. The Sweetwater land office was so packed with bodies that the windows fogged over, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and the heat of over 100 people. Every seat was taken. Miners, ranchers, and their wives stood 3 deep against the back wall, silent, watchful. Judge Horatio Bell presided. his face impassive. At the defendant's table sat Ephraim Calder, Pierce Dalton, and Jed Lyle. Calder, magnificent in his arrogance, looked bored. Dalton was a pale, sweating wreck, his slick hair now lank. Jed Lyle just stared at his own hands, his knuckles white. Gideon and Mara sat at the front, as before, but they were not alone. Reverend Abigail sat directly behind them, a silent pillar of support. Dr. May Lockwood was 2 seats down. Even Rook Dancy was there, huddled in the back, present under a writ of protection as a state's witness. The territorial prosecutor, a sharp man from Cheyenne, did not waste time. He was not interested in the civil contract. This was a criminal proceeding. His first witness was not Gideon. It was a man Mara had never seen, a small, nervous man in a green visor and ink-stained cuffs, who took the stand as if walking to a gallows. Please state your name. Ned Vickers. Sir, I was the chief accountant for the Calder Mining and Milling Company, Mr. Vickers, the prosecutor said, his voice cutting. Are you familiar with a practice known as servant contracts? Calder, who had been examining his fingernails, slowly looked up. Vickers swallowed. Yes, sir. It was a tool. We used them. For what purpose? Mr. Vickers, please examine these ledgers, marked Exhibit A, and explain to the court. Ned Vickers looked at the ledger, his own meticulous handwriting. He knew he was ruined. They were wage deductions. Sir, when a miner was in debt, for rent at the company boarding house, or for scrip at the company store, Mr. Calder would have him sign a paper, an indenture. It allowed us to garnish his pay, directly. To what percentage? 100%, sir. If the debt was large, we would pay them in scrip, and then seize the scrip. Legally. So these contracts, including the one signed by Miss Ellison, were not isolated incidents. They were a pattern of business. Yes, sir, Vickers whispered. It was how he kept the labor. It was how he controlled the debt. The room was utterly silent. The miners at the back, men who had feared Calder, were now looking at him with a cold, dawning, murderous rage. He had not just been their employer. He had been their owner. The second witness was Jed Lyle. Lyle walked to the stand, his legs unsteady. He did not look at Calder. He looked at the judge, his eyes pleading. He was a man cornered by his own sins, facing a long, dark stretch of prison for arson. He had made his choice. Mr. Lyle, you have confessed to this court that you set the fire that destroyed Mr. Gideon Vale's hay barn. Yes, sir, Lyle choked out. Why? I was told to. By whom? Lyle finally turned. He looked at the man who had employed him for 15 years. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at Ephraim Calder. By him? By him? Calder surged to his feet. Liar, you lying cur. Order. Judge Bell's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. Mr. Calder, you will sit, or I will have you bound and gagged. Continue, Mr. Lyle. Lyle was weeping now, the words spilling out in a desperate, ugly rush. He was crazy about the girl. After Vale crossed out the paper, he was furious. He said Vale had defied him. He said he'd ruin him. He told me to divert the water. When that didn't work, he told me to burn him out. He said if the woman had no food and no roof, she'd come crawling back. He said he wanted to force her back to the mine. He wanted to break both of them. The testimony was devastating. The prosecution rested. Judge Bell did not recess. He did not ask for summaries. He sat in the profound, thick silence for a full minute, his gaze resting on each of the 3 defendants. Then he put on his spectacles and read his judgment. Mr. Pierce Dalton, this court finds you guilty of conspiracy to defraud, of filing false legal instruments, and of willful contempt for the laws of this territory. You are a disgrace to your profession. You are hereby disbarred. You will serve 2 years in the territorial prison. Dalton made a small, sick sound and slumped in his chair. Mr. Jed Lyle, You have confessed to the crime of arson, a charge that carries a sentence of 20 years. In light of your full confession and testimony, this court reduces that sentence. You will serve 10 years at hard labor." Lyle collapsed, his head hitting the table, sobbing. Then, Judge Bell looked at Ephraim Calder. The room held its breath. "Mr. Ephraim Calder, this court finds you guilty. Guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud. Guilty of masterminding a criminal enterprise of wage theft. Guilty of conspiracy to commit arson." "And guilty," the judge's voice dropped, his eyes blazing, "of the vile and immoral attempt to enforce a contract of human bondage. The contract, 91B, is hereby declared void, null and without merit. From its inception, it is erased. This court orders you to pay a punitive fine of $10,000 to the territory. It orders you to pay restitution to Gideon Vale for the sum of $5,000 for the loss of his property, and it orders you to pay compensatory damages to Miss Mara Ellison for the sum of $2,000 for her suffering. And finally, for your crimes, which have poisoned this valley, you are sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison." The room was silent. Not a cheer, not a gasp. It was the silence of a mountain finally collapsing. Calder did not move. He just stared, his face gray, his arrogance shattered, a hollow, ruined man. "This court," Judge Bell said, his voice tired, "is—" "Your Honor." Gideon Vale stood up. The entire room turned to him. Judge Bell paused, his gavel in midair, and frowned. "Mr. Vale, the judgment is rendered." "I know, Your Honor." Gideon's voice was low, but it filled the room. "I ask one last privilege, for the record." He walked to the clerk's table. Lying there, on top of the pile of evidence, was the original, pristine copy of the contract, the one that had been lodged with the postmaster, the one without his markings. "May I?" Gideon asked the clerk. The clerk looked at the judge, who nodded, his curiosity piqued. Gideon unrolled the paper that had started it all. He stood before the court, before the town, before the woman he loved. He did not pick up his own pen. He reached for the heavy, official pen on the judge's own desk, the one that had just signed the verdict. He dipped it deep into the court's inkwell. He found the title, Indenture of Servant. With a force that spat a fine mist of ink, he drew one last, thick, black line through the word servant. It was a scar. It was a cancellation. It was an ending. Then, in the open space above the line, his hand steady, he wrote 2 words, large and clear, wife partner. He paused, then added the parentheses, a final declaration for the court record by free will. He set the pen down. He turned to Mara. She had risen from her seat and was standing beside him. She was looking at the paper, at the new title. She slowly raised her eyes to his. Her face was luminous. In the stunned, packed, silent courtroom, Gideon Vale, the widower of Dry Creek, leaned down, and Mara Ellison, the woman of ink and ash, rose up to meet him. They kissed. It was not a kiss of passion or of relief. It was a kiss of fact. It was short, and it was firm. It was a signature, witnessed by the entire town, and the room, the silence, shattered. It was not polite applause. It was a roar. It was a stampede of joy. The ranchers, the miners, the wives, Tam, Reed, Doctor, Lockwood, they were on their feet, cheering, stomping, whistling. The only other sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the pot-bellied stove, keeping time with the new heart of the valley. Sheriff Lonnie Pike, standing by the door, pushed his hat back, a slow, wide grin splitting his face. He looked at Reverend Abigail, who was dabbing her eyes with her sleeve. "Well, Reverend," Pike said over the din, "it appears the town constitution just got an amendment." Reverend Abigail, her face bright with a fierce, holy joy, just nodded. "No one belongs to anyone. Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and strong. "People belong to each other when they choose." Amid the celebration, Mara's hand found Gideon's. She laced her fingers through his. She looked down at her own wrist. the skin clean and pale. The blue-gray ghost of the ink was gone, erased by time, by work, by fire, and by love. The only thing that circled her now was the thin leather thong, the small, carved horseshoe resting warm against her skin. Gideon looked out the tall, fogged window. The sun had broken through the clouds. The last patches of the late snow on the roofs of Sweetwater were melting, dripping in fast, bright, silvery drops, as if the whole world were weeping with relief. Silver Butte, in the far distance, was lit bright gold, like a promise. He looked back at the contract on the table. The new, official, final contract. He looked at Mara. He picked up the judge's pen. He did not sign it. He held it out to her. Her hand, which had once trembled in fear in Dalton's office, was perfectly steady. She took the pen from him, and there, on the paper, beside the words wife-partner by free will, she signed her name. Not the name of a victim, not the name of a servant. She signed the name she had chosen, Mara Ellison Vale. Her hand lifted, the nib of the pen leaving one last, perfect drop of black ink. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to know where you are listening from. So please leave a comment below and let us connect and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video. And if you enjoyed it, please support us by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.